Benedict Voss never cried, not since he was a young man, long before the world knew his name, and long before he buried his emotions beneath layers of ambition and success. To his employees, he was a legend, a billionaire visionary who built empires with sheer willpower. To his peers, he was untouchable, a man who had everything. But on this particular afternoon, as Benedict stared out the window of his 50th floor office, he couldn't shake the strange hollowness in his chest. He had wealth, power, and respect, yet the silence in his life was deafening. Downstairs, a little girl named Ivy stood just outside the revolving glass doors of Voss Enterprises. She was small for her age, but her almond-shaped eyes held a sharpness that made her seem much older than 8. In her hand was a crumpled piece of paper, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. Ivy took a deep breath, brushing her thick chestnut curls out of her face, and stepped inside. The lobby was a world of polished marble and gleaming metal. The sheer scale of the place made her pause, but only for a moment. She was here for a reason, and nothing, not the suited men and women bustling past her, not the imposing security desk, and certainly not the towering building itself, was going to stop her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but soft as she approached the receptionist. The woman behind the desk barely glanced up from her computer. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but dismissive. Ivy squared her shoulders. "I need to see Mr. Voss." The receptionist blinked, now giving the girl her full attention. "Benedict Voss, the CEO?" "Yes," Ivy replied simply, her fingers tightening around the paper in her hand. The woman hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle this unexpected visitor. Before she could respond, a security guard approached. He was a tall man with kind gray eyes, and he knelt slightly to meet Ivy's gaze. "Are you looking for someone, little one?" he asked gently. Ivy nodded. "Benedict Voss, it's really important. I need to give him something." The guard exchanged a glance with the receptionist, who shrugged. Something about Ivy, her calm determination, the quiet urgency in her large, expressive eyes, must have moved him. The guard smiled faintly and said, "Wait here for a moment." Minutes later, Ivy was in an elevator, the walls of the city shrinking behind the glass as the car rose higher and higher. Her grip on the note tightened as she rehearsed the words in her head. Her heart thumped loudly, but her face remained calm. She didn't have time for fear. When the elevator doors opened, she was led into a sprawling office with a breathtaking view of the city skyline. At the far end of the room stood Benedict Voss, his back to her, silhouetted against the glass as he gazed at the distant horizon. The guard cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Voss, someone is here to see you." Benedict turned, his brow furrowing as his eyes landed on the small figure in the room. Ivy stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floors. "Who are you?" Benedict asked, his deep voice tinged with confusion. Ivy didn't flinch. She took a breath, unfolded the note, and held it out toward him with both hands. "My name is Ivy," she said, her voice unwavering. "I think you're my grandfather." The room went silent. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze as Benedict stared at her, then at the crumpled paper she held. His face, usually an unreadable mask, shifted into something unfamiliar, a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability. Slowly, he reached out and took the note. His hands, always steady in boardrooms and negotiations, trembled as he unfolded it. The words written on the page hit him like a hammer to the chest. His breath caught, and to his astonishment, a single tear rolled down his cheek. Benedict stared at the note in his hand, his mind racing to make sense of the words before him. The handwriting was unmistakable, curved and flowing, just as he remembered it. The letter wasn't long, but it carried the weight of 1,000 conversations left unsaid. Dear Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to say it in person. I'm sorry for the years we lost and the words we never found a way to say. I told Ivy everything about you, the man you are, and the man I hope you'll choose to be. Please take care of her. She's all I ever had, and now she's all I can leave you. I trust you'll do what's right. Love always, Celeste. His breath hitched as her name stared back at him. Celeste, his daughter, the one he had pushed away years ago in the pursuit of his empire. His knees threatened to give out, but he steadied himself, his hand clutching the corner of his desk for support. He closed his eyes, the memory of Celeste's laughter flashing in his mind like an old photograph brought to life. Ivy stood quietly, her head tilted as she observed him. She didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening, but she knew enough to stay silent. After a moment, Benedict opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no mistaking the resemblance now, the shape of her chin, the curve of her lips. She was a mirror of Celeste at that age. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out strained, the usually commanding tone softened by an edge of vulnerability. Ivy hesitated, her small fingers twisting the hem of her jacket. "Mom gave it to me. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should find you." Benedict's heart sank. "Happened to her? What do you mean?" Ivy's gaze dropped to the floor. "She got sick, a lot. And one day," her voice faltered, "she didn't wake up." The words hit Benedict like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, sinking into the leather chair behind his desk. For a man who had faced down boardroom titans and political leaders, this was a pain he couldn't navigate. His mind flooded with questions. How had Celeste lived after she left? What had she endured? And why had he never reached out? Ivy shifted on her feet, unsure if she had done something wrong. "I didn't mean to make you sad," she said quietly. Benedict shook his head, pulling himself back to the moment. "No, Ivy, you didn't do anything wrong." His voice softened, and for the first time in decades, there was genuine emotion behind his words. I didn't know. About your mom. About you." Her lips quivered, but she quickly steadied herself. "Mom said you were really smart and really busy. She didn't want to bother you." The guilt washed over him like a tidal wave. "She thought that?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "She thought she was bothering me?" Ivy nodded. "She said you cared more about your business, but she didn't say it to be mean. She just wanted me to understand." Benedict clenched his jaw, the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He had built a fortune, an empire, and a name that would outlast him. But at what cost? The words of his estranged daughter echoed in his mind, her trust in him now resting in the form of a little girl standing before him. "Ivy," he said after a long pause, his voice firm despite the emotion threatening to break through. "I need to make things right. For you, for your mom." Her wide eyes searched his face, her lips curving into a cautious smile. "You mean you're not going to send me away?" "Never," he replied, the weight of his promise sinking into his chest. "You're staying here, with me." For the first time, Ivy's face lit up with relief, and she stepped closer to him, her small hand tentatively reaching for his. Benedict didn't hesitate. He took her hand in his, a spark of hope igniting somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't too late. Not yet. But as they sat in the silence of that moment, a nagging question lingered in his mind. Why had Celeste been so secretive about her struggles? And who, if anyone, might not want Ivy here? The answer, he feared, would not be a simple one. Benedict Voss sat in his office long after Ivy had gone to rest in the guest suite. His house staff had hurriedly prepared for her. The weight of her arrival pressed down on him, heavier than the responsibilities of any boardroom decision he'd ever faced. His gaze drifted back to the note, now spread flat on his desk, the words etched into his mind like scars on a battlefield. Please take care of her. He leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Regret clawed at him, a relentless reminder of the years he'd lost with Celeste. He had buried himself in work, telling himself it was for her, for the family they could have been. But deep down, he had known the truth. His pride and ambition had driven her away. And now she was gone. The faint sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He glanced up to see Ivy standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed animal. Her eyes were wide and hesitant, as if she were debating whether she'd made a mistake coming back. "Can't sleep?" Benedict asked, softening his voice in a way that felt foreign to him. Ivy shook her head. "It's too quiet here. At home, there were always cars and noises outside." Benedict gestured for her to come in. "This place does get a bit still at night." She padded across the room and climbed into the chair opposite his desk, her stuffed animal perched on her lap. For a moment, they sat in silence, the vast space between them slowly shrinking. "Do you miss her?" Ivy asked suddenly, her voice small. The question took Benedict off guard. He wasn't used to answering personal questions. He was used to deflecting, redirecting, controlling the narrative. But this time, he couldn't bring himself to lie. "Every day," he admitted. "Even when I didn't see her, I thought about her. He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't know how to fix things." Ivy tilted her head. "Mom said people make mistakes, but they can try to make them better." Her simplicity and sincerity struck him. "She was right," he said, his voice quieter now. "And that's what I want to do, for her, and for you." Ivy's lips twitched into a small smile. "Mom would like that." As the two of them sat together, Benedict found himself studying her. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, but didn't know how to frame. What had her life been like? Had Celeste been happy? What had led to the mysterious void of communication all these years? The questions would have to wait, but one thing was clear. He owed Ivy more than just a roof over her head. He owed her the truth. "Do you remember a lot about her?" Benedict asked carefully. Ivy nodded. "She was really funny and brave, and she always made sure I had everything I needed." Her voice grew quieter. "But sometimes she was scared." Benedict's heart tightened. "Scared? Of what?" Ivy shrugged, playing with the frayed ear of her stuffed animal. "She didn't say, but sometimes she would lock the doors, even in the daytime. And she'd say things like, 'It's just us, Ivy,' like someone was going to take me away." Benedict straightened in his chair, his instincts flaring. He had spent decades navigating high-stakes negotiations, sensing when danger lurked beneath the surface. The way Ivy described Celeste's fear, it wasn't random. Someone had been a threat to them. "Did she ever mention anyone? A name, maybe?" he pressed gently. Ivy shook her head, her brow furrowed. "Just him. She'd say, 'He won't find us here.' But I don't know who she meant." A chill ran down Benedict's spine. There was more to Celeste's story than he'd realized. Whatever, or whoever, she had been running from, it wasn't over. And now Ivy was in his care. He reached across the desk and placed a hand over hers. "You're safe here, Ivy. I promise." Her small hand gripped his tightly, her trust in him unspoken but palpable. For the first time in years, Benedict felt a flicker of purpose beyond the walls of his empire. Ivy wasn't just his second chance. She was his responsibility now, and whatever shadows from the past had followed her here, he was ready to face them. But as Ivy's eyelids grew heavy and her head began to nod, Benedict couldn't shake the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. There were too many unanswered questions. And somewhere in the silence of the night, he felt the faintest trace of a storm brewing. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Benedict's mansion, illuminating its pristine surfaces and expensive furniture. The quiet was broken by the soft patter of Ivy's feet as she wandered into the dining room, drawn by the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the clatter of silverware. Benedict was already seated at the long, polished table, scrolling through his tablet, while a chef set down a plate of eggs and toast before him. Ivy hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she was supposed to be there. She clutched her stuffed rabbit and shuffled forward slowly. Benedict looked up and smiled, a gesture so rare on his face that it startled the staff nearby. "Good morning," he said, setting the tablet aside. "Did you sleep better?" Ivy nodded and slid into the chair across from him. "Yeah, the big bed was nice, but I still miss my old one." Benedict's heart sank at the mention of her home. He'd spent the night thinking about the fractured pieces of her life and the danger that might still be lurking. He signaled to the chef, who quickly brought a plate of pancakes for Ivy, along with a small glass of orange juice. "Eat up," Benedict said. "You'll need your strength. Today, we're going to figure some things out." Ivy perked up. "What kind of things?" Benedict hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. "I've asked someone to help me learn more about your mom, about what happened before you came here. I think she might have been worried about something." Ivy chewed her pancake thoughtfully. "Mom didn't like to talk about stuff like that. She said we just had to keep moving forward." "That's what I want to do too," Benedict said. "But to keep moving forward, I need to understand what happened." As they ate, Benedict's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from his private investigator, Langston Shaw. "Need to talk. Found something unusual. Call me when you're free." Benedict's stomach tightened. He excused himself briefly, stepping into his private study to return the call. Langston answered on the first ring. "I've been digging into Celeste's past like you asked," Langston began, his tone serious. "It's complicated. She was renting a small place under a different name." "A different name?" Benedict repeated, his brow furrowing. "Why?" "I don't know yet," Langston admitted. "But it gets stranger. She had no steady income that I can trace, but she wasn't behind on rent. Someone was helping her." Benedict gripped the edge of his desk. "Who?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Langston replied. "But I found something else. A man, late 40s, average build, visited her regularly. He wasn't listed as a tenant, but neighbors said he argued with her a lot." Benedict's mind raced. "Do we know who he is?" "Not yet, but I'll find out," Langston assured him. "One more thing. You said her daughter's with you now, right?" "Yes," Benedict said sharply. "Why?" "Be careful," Langston said. "If this man was causing trouble for Celeste, he might come looking for Ivy too." Benedict's jaw tightened. "I won't let anything happen to her." After hanging up, he returned to the dining room. Ivy was still at the table, stacking syrup-soaked pancakes into an elaborate tower. She looked up and grinned when she saw him. "Look, it's like a castle," she said proudly. Benedict forced a smile, his thoughts elsewhere. He couldn't let her see his worry. "It's very impressive," he said, sitting down again. "Maybe you'll be an architect one day?" Ivy giggled. "Nah, I want to be a teacher, like Mom wanted to be." The mention of Celeste brought his focus back to the task at hand. Someone had been involved in her life, someone who had caused her fear. And now that same shadow might be looming over Ivy. As they finished breakfast, Benedict resolved to find answers. Whoever had haunted Celeste's life was not going to touch Ivy, not on his watch. But the growing knot in his chest told him that uncovering the truth would be far more dangerous than he anticipated. Later that morning, Benedict sat in his study, the room filled with the quiet hum of his thoughts. He stared at the photograph Ivy had brought with her, a small, creased picture of Celeste. She looked radiant, her smile unguarded, a young ivy perched on her hip. But standing beside her was a man Benedict didn't recognize, his arm slung casually over her shoulder. The man's face, though friendly, held an edge of something Benedict couldn't quite place. Who was he? And why had Celeste never mentioned him? The knock at the door broke his reverie. Ivy peeked in, her stuffed rabbit still in tow. "Can I come in?" "Of course," Benedict said, motioning for her to enter. She climbed onto the leather armchair across from his desk, watching him with curious eyes. "Are you mad?" she asked suddenly, her voice small. He frowned, confused. "Mad? At what?" "Mom," she said hesitantly, "for not telling you about me." Benedict's heart twisted. "No, Ivy, I'm not mad. I wish I'd known sooner. I could have been there for both of you." She nodded solemnly, as if weighing his words. "Mom said she didn't think you'd want to see us." Her honesty hit him like a blow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Ivy, that's not true. I made mistakes with your mom, but I never stopped caring about her, or about you." She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the edge of the desk. "Mom said you were really smart, and she said you'd take care of me if I ever needed you." Benedict's throat tightened. "I will," he said firmly. "I promise." The phone on his desk buzzed again, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen. It was Langston Shaw. "I need to take this," Benedict said. "Wait here, okay?" Ivy nodded, settling deeper into the chair as he answered the call. "I've got a name," Langston said without preamble. "The man who visited Celeste regularly, his name is Victor Dane. He's got a record, fraud, assault, and a history of manipulating vulnerable women." Benedict's grip on the phone tightened. What was his connection to Celeste? "It's unclear," Langston said, "but there's something else. Dane vanished a few weeks after Celeste passed. No forwarding address, no activity on his accounts." Benedict's stomach sank. "Do you think he's a threat to Ivy?" "It's possible," Langston said gravely. "If he was tied to Celeste's life, he might come looking for her daughter, especially if he thinks Ivy knows something." Benedict's mind raced. "I need to know everything about him, his associates, his patterns, anything." "I'm on it," Langston promised. "But be careful, Benedict. This guy isn't just a petty criminal. If he thinks you're in his way, he won't hesitate to act." After hanging up, Benedict turned back to Ivy. She had been quietly watching him, her eyes filled with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, just some business I need to take care of." But as she nodded and went back to fiddling with her stuffed rabbit, Benedict felt the weight of the lie settle on him. Everything was far from fine. Victor Dane wasn't just a loose thread in Celeste's life. He was a storm cloud that had lingered on the horizon, waiting to strike. He couldn't let Ivy see his fear, but he also couldn't let his guard down. Whoever Victor Dane was, whatever he wanted, Benedict was prepared to fight. For Celeste's memory, for Ivy, for the family he never thought he'd have a chance to protect. Yet deep in the recesses of his mind, another question gnawed at him. What if Dane wasn't the only one tied to Celeste's mysterious past? What if there was more to her story than even Ivy could tell? As Ivy's laughter echoed through the study, Benedict vowed silently he would find out, and no matter what it took, he would keep her safe. As the day stretched into afternoon, Benedict grew restless. The questions swirling in his mind left no room for peace, and the name Victor Dane weighed heavily on him. He paced his study, glancing intermittently at his phone, waiting for an update from Langston. Across the hall, Ivy's soft humming drifted from the sitting room where she was playing with a set of building blocks Benedict had hastily ordered that morning. The quiet was shattered by the sharp ring of his phone. He snatched it up, his voice clipped. "What do you have?" Langston's voice was steady but grim. "I've pieced together more about Victor Dane. He was deeply involved in a fraud scheme, laundering money through fake charities. He targeted women who were struggling financially, convincing them to help him cover up his operations." Benedict's stomach churned. And Celeste? Was she one of them? "It looks that way," Langston replied. "Her financial records show small deposits from accounts tied to Dane's fake charities. But here's the kicker. She pulled out of the arrangement a year before her death. That's when things got messy." "What do you mean?" Benedict asked, his jaw tightening. "She filed a restraining order against Dane," Langston said. "Claimed he was stalking her, showing up unannounced, making threats. The order was granted, but enforcement was spotty. A month later, Celeste moved to a new apartment under that alias." Benedict sank into his chair, the weight of the revelations crashing over him. "So Dane didn't just vanish after her death, he went underground." "Exactly," Langston confirmed. "And I doubt he's gone for good." Benedict's grip on the phone tightened. "Does he know about Ivy?" "There's no evidence he does," Langston said. "But if he finds out she's with you, that might change. He might see her as leverage, or worse." Benedict felt his blood run cold. "Keep digging. I want every detail on this man." After hanging up, Benedict sat motionless, his mind racing through scenarios. Victor Dane had been a specter haunting Celeste's life, and now he was a potential threat to Ivy. Benedict couldn't let that happen. For years, he had prided himself on being in control, on staying 2 steps ahead of everyone. Now, for the first time, he felt the sharp edge of vulnerability. Ivy appeared in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "You look worried," she said, tilting her head. Benedict forced a smile. "I'm just thinking about some work stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." She didn't look convinced. "Mom always said I could tell when someone wasn't telling the whole truth." He sighed, motioning for her to sit. "You're right. There's something on my mind, but it's my job to make sure you're safe, Ivy. That's all I care about right now." "Safe from what?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "From someone your mom had to deal with," he said carefully. "Someone who wasn't a good person." Her eyes widened. "Is he going to come after me?" "No," Benedict said firmly. "I won't let that happen. You're safe here with me. I promise." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but if you need help, I'm really good at hiding. Mom and I used to play hide-and-seek all the time." The simplicity of her offer made his chest ache. "You won't need to hide," he said softly. "Not anymore." That night, Benedict didn't sleep. He spent hours combing through Langston's reports, reviewing security footage, and making calls to tighten the defenses around his estate. He had spent years building an impenetrable empire. He'd do the same for Ivy, no matter the cost. But as dawn broke and the world began to stir, a nagging question refused to leave him. If Dane was lurking in the shadows, what was he waiting for? And how long before the past came knocking on his door again? The following morning, Benedict was already seated in his study, scanning through Langston's latest report, when a soft knock startled him. He glanced up to see Ivy peeking into the room, her hair still messy from sleep, her stuffed rabbit in hand. "Can we have pancakes again?" she asked, her voice tentative. Benedict managed a small smile. "Of course, I'll have the chef make you some." She stepped further in, her expression uncertain. "You didn't sleep, did you?" He sighed, setting the report down. "I had a lot on my mind." "Is it about that man?" Ivy asked, her voice small. "The one Mom was scared of?" Benedict paused. He didn't want to burden her with the details, but he couldn't bring himself to lie to her completely. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm trying to make sure he can't hurt you." She nodded, climbing into the chair across from him. "Mom always said being scared was okay, as long as you didn't let it stop you." Her words, so simple yet profound, struck a chord deep within him. "Your mom was a smart woman," he said, his voice softening. "She was brave too." Ivy smiled faintly. "She said you were brave too. She said you'd protect me." Something inside Benedict shifted. He had been a man who calculated every move, who built walls to keep others out. But now, faced with this small, vulnerable girl, he felt a resolve stronger than any he'd known before. "Always," he said, "I'll always protect you." Before he could say more, his phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen. Langston again. He answered quickly, signaling Ivy to wait. "Langston, what do you have?" Langston's voice was urgent. "I found something you need to see. Dane didn't just disappear. He's been lying low in a property owned by one of his associates, and it gets worse." Benedict's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "There's chatter," Langston said. "I pulled some strings, and a contact of mine overheard Dane talking about Ivy. He knows she's with you." Benedict's heart dropped. "How? How does he know?" "Not sure yet, but my guess is he's been watching for signs of Celeste's movements, bank accounts, hospital records, anything. When you took Ivy in, it probably set off a red flag." The weight of Langston's words hit him hard. Dane was aware, and now Ivy was a target. "What's his angle?" Benedict asked, his voice cold. "Money, most likely," Langston replied. "Or leverage. He might think Ivy knows something he can use." Benedict exhaled sharply, his mind already spinning with contingency plans. "Send me everything you have on him. I want a full dossier." "It's on its way," Langston said. "And Benedict, be careful. Dane's dangerous and he's got nothing to lose." After ending the call, Benedict turned back to Ivy. Her curious eyes followed him, sensing the tension in the air. "Is it him?" she asked quietly. Benedict hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but don't worry, Ivy. He can't get to you here." She looked at him for a long moment before climbing down from the chair and crossing the room. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around him, her stuffed rabbit squished between them. Benedict froze, unaccustomed to such an open gesture of affection, but after a moment he placed a hand on her back. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than her. "I'll make sure of it." As Ivy left to find breakfast, Benedict turned back to his desk. His thoughts were already racing. Dane's awareness of Ivy changed everything. It wasn't just about uncovering Celeste's past anymore. It was about keeping Ivy safe in the present. The mansion's security was formidable, but Benedict wasn't taking any chances. He called his head of security, issuing orders for increased surveillance and patrols around the estate. Cameras, guards, electronic fences, nothing would be left to chance. Yet deep down, he knew that Dane's interest in Ivy wasn't random. There was something more to this, something he couldn't yet see. And until he uncovered the full truth, the threat wouldn't go away. As the morning wore on, Benedict steeled himself for what was to come. He had built his empire by facing impossible odds and coming out on top. Now he would do the same for Ivy. But unlike his battles in the boardroom, this wasn't about power or reputation. This was personal. And Benedict wasn't about to let anything happen to the granddaughter who had already become his second chance at family. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Benedict threw himself into fortifying the estate and working closely with Langston to track Victor Dane's movements. His sprawling mansion, once a symbol of untouchable power, now felt like a fortress under siege. Extra guards patrolled the grounds. Cameras were installed at every angle, and Benedict even added reinforced locks to the doors. Despite these precautions, the unease in his chest never lifted. Ivy, on the other hand, seemed blissfully unaware of the rising tension. She spent her days exploring the mansion, her laughter occasionally echoing through its cavernous halls. Benedict found himself checking on her frequently, unable to shake the fear that she might vanish if he let his guard down for even a second. Late one evening, as Benedict reviewed Langston's latest report in his study, his phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't Langston. It was an unknown number. His instincts flared, but he answered, his voice sharp. "Who is this?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then a low, gravelly voice spoke. "Hello." Mr. Voss. Benedict's grip on the phone tightened. "Dane?" The man chuckled, the sound oozing with arrogance. "You've been busy, haven't you? All those guards, cameras. It's impressive. Almost as if you're expecting someone." "What do you want?" Benedict demanded, his voice cold and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. "What I've always wanted," Dane said smoothly. "What Celeste owed me." "She didn't owe you anything," Benedict snapped. "Stay away from Ivy." Dane's laugh was quiet but menacing. "Oh, I don't think I can do that. You see, your little granddaughter might know things that could be very useful to me. And if not, well, she's still quite valuable." Benedict's blood boiled. "You won't get anywhere near her." "Maybe," Dane said with a shrug in his tone, "but you can't watch her every second, can you?" The line went dead. Benedict slammed the phone down, his chest heaving with anger and fear. Dane wasn't just a threat, he was a predator, circling closer. And now he had made his intentions clear. That night, Benedict couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkened study, replaying Dane's words over and over. Ivy was fast asleep in the room down the hall, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The sight of her earlier, so peaceful and innocent, had only strengthened his resolve. He would stop Dane, no matter the cost. As dawn broke, Langston called with another update. "We've got a lead," he said. Dane's associate, one of the guys helping him stay under the radar, was spotted near a warehouse in the city's industrial district. We think Dane might be using it as a hideout. Benedict's jaw clenched. "Send me the address." "Benedict, listen," Langston warned. "This guy is dangerous. Don't do anything reckless. Let me send a team." "There's no time," Benedict interrupted. "If Dane thinks he can get to Ivy, I need to stop him now." Langston sighed. "At least let me go with you?" "Fine," Benedict relented. "But this ends tonight." By evening, Benedict and Langston were parked outside the nondescript warehouse. The building was dark except for a faint light spilling from a window on the second floor. Benedict's heart pounded as they crept closer, keeping to the shadows. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. Benedict's sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for signs of life. Langston gestured toward the stairs, and the two men ascended silently. Every creak of the old wood felt deafening. At the top of the stairs, they found a small office, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Dane was sitting at a desk, his back to them, talking on the phone. "I'll get what I'm owed," Dane was saying. "He won't stop me. No one will." Benedict stepped into the room, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You're wrong about that." Dane spun around, his expression flickering from surprise to amusement. "Well, well, the mighty Benedict Voss, come to join the party." "This ends now," Benedict said, his tone deadly. "Stay away from Ivy. Stay away from my family." Dane leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Or what? You think your money scares me? I've been in worse situations than this." Benedict's eyes burned with cold fury. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Dane stood, his movements slow and calculated. "You can't protect her forever, Voss. Sooner or later, you'll slip up. And when you do—" Benedict cut him off, stepping closer. "If you even think about going near her, I'll make sure you regret it." Dane's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "We'll see," he said quietly. As Langston stepped forward, pulling out his phone to call the authorities, Benedict kept his eyes locked on Dane. He had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Dane wasn't finished. Not yet. Benedict and Langston left the warehouse in tense silence, the weight of the confrontation heavy on both of them. Though the authorities would be alerted and Dane's hideout compromised, Benedict knew the man's words weren't empty threats. Dane was resourceful, ruthless, and desperate. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, or until someone stopped him for good. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. Ivy sat on the plush living room carpet, her stuffed rabbit propped up beside her as she built a tall tower out of wooden blocks. Her laughter rang through the room as one of the house staff complimented her creation, but Benedict could only manage a faint smile as he watched from the doorway. "Is everything okay?" Ivy asked, looking up at him. "Yes," Benedict lied. "How's the tower coming along?" "It's almost done," she said excitedly. "But it might fall over. That's okay, though. I can always build it again." Her words, so innocent, struck Benedict harder than he expected. She didn't realize how closely they mirrored his own life, how everything he had built before felt fragile now, teetering on the edge of collapse. But unlike the tower, he couldn't let Ivy's world come crashing down. As Ivy turned back to her blocks, Benedict's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Langston. "Dane's been tipped off about the mansion's location. Be on guard." Benedict's chest tightened, his fingers clenching around the phone. He immediately called his head of security. "I need double patrols around the property tonight," he said firmly. "Every entrance, every blind spot. Nothing gets through. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the head of security replied. "We'll keep watch." Despite the reassurances, unease prickled at the back of Benedict's mind. Dane had already proven himself relentless. A man like that wouldn't be deterred by locked doors or armed guards. Benedict had to be ready for anything. The night stretched on, the house cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Ivy was fast asleep in her room, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm as she dreamed peacefully. Benedict stood outside her door, his arms crossed, his ears attuned to every sound. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, more suffocating than any boardroom pressure he'd ever faced. He moved to his study, where a monitor displayed the live feeds from the mansion's security cameras. The guards patrolled in steady intervals, the perimeter secured. Still, something felt off. Benedict's instincts, honed from years of reading people and situations, screamed that the calm wouldn't last. His phone buzzed again. This time, a call from Langston. Benedict answered immediately. "I just got word," Langston said, his voice low. "Dane's on the move. My source says he's not alone." Benedict's pulse quickened. "How close is he?" "Not far," Langston replied. "But it's worse than that. He's got someone on the inside feeding him information." Benedict froze. "What?" "There's a mole, Benedict. Someone in your staff is working with Dane. That's how he knows so much." Benedict's mind raced as Langston's words sank in. He had tightened the mansion's defenses, but it didn't matter if someone on the inside was undermining his efforts. His trust in the people around him now felt like a liability. "Any idea who it is?" Benedict asked, his voice tight. "Not yet," Langston admitted. "But be careful. Dane won't wait for an invitation." Benedict ended the call and stared at the security feeds, his jaw clenched. The betrayal cut deep. He had always prided himself on his ability to control his environment, to foresee every angle. Now that control felt like an illusion. He was about to call the head of security when a faint sound reached his ears. A creak, subtle but unmistakable, coming from the direction of Ivy's room. Adrenaline surged through him. He moved quickly, his footsteps silent against the carpeted hallway. As he approached Ivy's door, he saw it, barely ajar, the faint light spilling into the hallway. His heart pounded as he pushed the door open. Inside, Ivy's bed was empty, the sheets rumpled but cold. The stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the floor. Benedict's chest constricted. He turned sharply, scanning the room for any sign of her. His voice came out low and urgent. "Ivy?" No answer. The silence was deafening, the stillness unnatural. He moved toward the open window, his eyes narrowing at the faint scuff marks on the sill. Someone had been there. A chill ran through him as realization dawned. Dane had made his move. Without hesitation, Benedict grabbed his phone, dialing Langston as he bolted from the room. "She's gone," he said, his voice a mix of fear and fury. "They've taken Ivy." Langston's response was immediate. "I'll track them. Stay where you are." "No," Benedict cut in, his voice like steel. "I'm going after her. This ends tonight." Benedict raced to the security room, barking orders to the guards to sweep the property and review the footage. Every second counted. Ivy was out there, and Dane had her, and Benedict would move heaven and earth to bring her back. Section 9. Benedict's heart pounded as he stormed into the mansion's security room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The guards, already scrambling to review the live camera feeds, froze as he barked out orders. "Focus on the outer perimeter," he snapped, his voice sharp and steady despite the panic threatening to consume him. "I want every frame of footage from the last hour reviewed. Check the gates, the fences, and every blind spot. We don't stop until we know how they got in and where they went." "Yes, sir," one of the guards replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Langston's voice buzzed in his earpiece. "Benedict, I've got my team pulling street camera footage from the area. If Dane used a vehicle, we'll find it." "He's working with someone inside," Benedict growled. "Find out who it is. I don't care what it takes." Langston hesitated. "Be careful. You're angry, and I get it. But if we're going to get Ivy back, we can't afford mistakes." Benedict didn't respond. He wasn't interested in measured words or calculated moves. He was ready to dismantle anyone who stood between him and Ivy. The security footage finally revealed the breach. At precisely 1:12 a.m., one of the guards stationed at the southern gate had stepped away, leaving it unmonitored for less than 2 minutes. In that small window, a dark figure slipped through, moving swiftly and with purpose. "That's Dane," Benedict said, his jaw clenched. "Zoom in." The guard enhanced the footage, revealing a grainy but recognizable image. Dane, dressed in dark clothing, was carrying a small bundle in his arms, one that made Benedict's stomach churn. It was Ivy, wrapped tightly in a blanket, her head resting against his shoulder. The sight ignited a fury in Benedict that bordered on feral. He turned to the guard. "Where does that gate lead?" "A service road," the guard replied. "It connects to the main highway about 2 miles down." Benedict's mind raced. "Check the footage from the highway cameras. I want to know what vehicle he's using." Minutes later, the footage from a highway camera came through. A black van with obscured plates was seen speeding away from the direction of the mansion. Langston's voice crackled over the earpiece. "We've got the van. It was last seen heading toward the docks on the west side of the city." Benedict didn't hesitate. "Send me the coordinates." Langston's tone turned cautious. "Benedict, wait for backup. Dane isn't alone, and he's dangerous." "There's no time," Benedict snapped. "I'm not waiting for anyone." The docks loomed ahead, their industrial structures casting long shadows under the faint glow of overhead lights. Benedict's car screeched to a halt, and he stepped out, his eyes scanning the rows of warehouses. The air was cold and thick with the smell of salt and oil, but Benedict didn't notice. His entire focus was on finding Ivy. Langston's voice came through again. "Dane's van is parked near Warehouse 17. My team's 5 minutes out." "I'm going in," Benedict interrupted, cutting the connection. Moving quickly but carefully, he approached the warehouse. The faint sound of muffled voices reached his ears, and he slipped around the side of the building, finding an unlocked service door. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Stacks of crates and abandoned machinery created a maze of shadows. Then he heard it, a small, frightened voice. "Please let me go." It was Ivy. His chest tightened as he followed the sound, his movements silent but deliberate. He spotted them near the center of the warehouse. Dane stood with Ivy, who was sitting on a crate, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. 2 other men lingered nearby, their postures tense, their eyes darting toward the entrance. "Relax," Dane said, his tone mocking. "No one's coming for you, kid. Your grandpa doesn't care about anyone but himself." "You're wrong," Ivy said, her voice trembling but defiant. "He'll come for me." Benedict stepped out of the shadows. She's right. All eyes snapped to him. Dane's smug expression faltered for a split second before he recovered, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Benedict Voss, I was wondering when you'd show up." "Let her go," Benedict said, his voice cold and steady. "Now." Dane shrugged, gesturing lazily to his men. "And if I don't?" Benedict didn't answer. Instead, he moved with startling speed, catching the first man off guard with a sharp blow that sent him sprawling. The second lunged at him, but Benedict dodged, his years of discipline and control fueling his movements. He didn't stop until both men were down, groaning on the floor. Dane grabbed Ivy, pulling her close as a shield. "Don't come any closer," he snarled. "You won't," Benedict cut in, his voice like steel. "You don't touch her. Not now, not ever." For the first time, Dane hesitated. Benedict took another step forward, his gaze locked on Ivy, who was trembling but holding on to her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. "Let her go," Benedict said again, softer this time but no less commanding. "It's over, Dane." Dane's resolve cracked. He shoved Ivy forward and bolted for the exit, but before he could escape, Langston and his team burst through the doors, weapons drawn. Dane froze, his hands raised in surrender. Benedict rushed to Ivy, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her small frame shaking against his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You're safe now. I've got you." And for the first time in years, Benedict Voss felt something he thought he'd lost forever: relief. Section 10. The aftermath of the rescue unfolded in a blur of flashing lights and hurried voices. Police swarmed the warehouse, securing Dane and his accomplices, while Langston's team coordinated with local authorities. Benedict stayed close to Ivy, shielding her from the chaos, his arm firmly wrapped around her small shoulders. She clung to him, her stuffed rabbit crushed between them, her wide eyes darting nervously around the scene. "You're safe now," he whispered softly. "No one will hurt you again. I promise." Ivy nodded against his chest, her grip tightening. Despite her bravery, she was still a child, and the events of the night had shaken her. Benedict could feel her trembling, and it fueled his resolve. Dane was finished, and he would ensure no shadow of the man remained to haunt Ivy's future. Langston approached, his usually calm demeanor edged with concern. "Dane's in custody," he said. "They'll take him in for questioning, but the evidence we've gathered should be enough to put him away for good." "Good," Benedict said curtly, his focus still on Ivy. "I don't want him anywhere near her." Langston hesitated. "There's one more thing you should know. When we searched the van, we found documents, letters, photographs. Dane kept records of Celeste's life. He'd been watching her for years." Benedict's stomach churned. "Why?" "To control her," Langston replied, "to make sure she couldn't escape him. When she did, he lost his grip. Ivy became his leverage, or so he thought." Benedict clenched his jaw, a deep anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Dane had robbed Celeste of her peace, and by extension, he had stolen time and memories from Benedict as well. But he wouldn't let Dane steal anything else, not from him, and certainly not from Ivy. The car ride back to the mansion was quiet. Ivy sat in the back seat beside Benedict, leaning against him as exhaustion overtook her. Her breathing was slow and steady, but her grip on his sleeve never loosened. Benedict gazed down at her, the weight of responsibility settling into something deeper, something permanent. When they arrived home, the staff greeted them with subdued relief, their worried faces softening at the sight of Ivy, safe and sound. Benedict carried her upstairs, her small frame still curled against him. He tucked her into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her stuffed rabbit rested beside her. As he turned to leave, her soft voice stopped him. "Grandpa?" He paused, turning back. "Yes, Ivy?" She looked at him with sleepy but serious eyes. "You didn't let him win." A lump formed in his throat. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, Ivy, I didn't, and I never will." She smiled faintly before her eyes drifted shut, her breathing evening out as she fell asleep. Benedict sat there for a moment, watching her. The world outside could be ruthless and unforgiving, but here, in this room, was his chance to build something different, a world where Ivy could feel safe, loved, and unbroken. The next morning, Benedict found himself in his study, holding one of the documents Langston had mentioned, a letter Celeste had written, but never sent. Her familiar handwriting stretched across the page, and as he read, her words wrapped around him like a bittersweet embrace. "Dad, I hope this letter finds you someday. I know we've had our differences, but I never stopped loving you. I always told Ivy about her grandpa, the man who could solve anything, who built his own world from nothing. I wanted her to know the best parts of you, the parts I still believe in. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I wish I could have told you everything in person, but I didn't want my mistakes to burden you. Ivy's the best part of me, and I know she'll be safe with you. Protect her, Dad. Show her the world you always wanted to show me. And if you can, forgive me for leaving, for not reaching out. Forgive yourself, too. We both did the best we could with what we had. Love always. Celeste." Benedict closed the letter, his hands trembling. He sat back in his chair, staring out the window as the sun rose higher in the sky. Forgiveness had never come easily to him, but Celeste's words had planted a seed of something new, a quiet hope, a path forward. Ivy's footsteps broke his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her rabbit in hand. "Good morning," she said, her voice bright. "Good morning," Benedict replied, a genuine smile softening his face. She climbed into his lap, looking at the letter in his hand. "Is that from Mom?" "Yes," Benedict said, his voice steady. "She wanted us to take care of each other." Ivy nodded solemnly. "We will." As they sat together, the morning light streaming through the window, Benedict felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Ivy wasn't just his second chance. She was his purpose, his legacy, and his family. And he would protect her with everything he had.